This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Sean Karemaker. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, and on this show, I talk with Sean Karemaker. His new book, Feast of Fields, was released recently from Conundrum Press, and I have an insightful conversation with him about his new memoir, as well as his earlier comics. But before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by those wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off the cover price, and every month you'll find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but occasionally you can find discounts that are more impressive than that. And if you go to DCB Service right now, you'll find incredible savings on a variety of comics, including bundles of titles from such publishers as DC, Marvel, and Valiant. And this month you'll also find two notable bundles, both from DC, and these include the Jinx World bundle, which you could get at 50% off cover price, and then there's the Sandman Universe bundle at 45% off the cover price. And of course, you can find big savings on single issues and single volumes of your favorite titles as well. Whatever kind of comics you enjoy reading, you really can't beat the prices at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com right now for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. Sean Karemaker's comics are a different kind of reading experience. He illustrates in a highly detailed texture style, and his stories flow in a dreamlike manner, free from the constrictions of sequential paneling. In fact, he creates many of his comics in a scroll-like manner, writing out his narratives across a broad horizontal field, and then later deciding how to break up his illustration across pages. The result, as we find in his latest book, Feast of Fields, is a story whose unveiling reflects the process of memory, a sort of streaming of experience with a zig-zagging quality between past and present. In my interview with Sean, I talk with him about his style of cartooning, and especially the genesis of his latest book. It's largely the story of his mother during her time in a Danish orphanage, but he contextualizes her narrative by placing it within his own life experiences and revealing what his mother's past has meant to him. I also talk with Sean about his previous book from Conundrum, The Ghosts We Know, a collection of short pieces that are largely autobiographical in nature and provide a wonderful introduction to Karemaker's style of comics storytelling. I learned a lot from talking with Sean about his work, and I want to share that conversation with you right now. I have the pleasure of talking with Sean Karemaker. He has a new book out from Conundrum, Feast of Fields, and that came out earlier this month. Sean, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing really well, and I have to say I'm impressed by this new book, Feast of Fields. It is in many ways quite different from your previous work, which also came out from Conundrum, The Ghosts We Know. Describe what Feast of Fields is and what it means to you, or what it meant to you in creating this work.
Well, Feast of Fields is a memoir, or it's a biography about my mom. Like, it's mostly focuses on her childhood. She grew up in an orphanage in Denmark, and that was something that I always knew. She told me a lot of stories about her youth, but I wanted to understand it better and I wanted to immerse myself in those stories. So Feast of Fields was an attempt to kind of understand these things better by projecting myself into the stories and really spending a lot of time inside those stories. So the way I drew the book was in the form of a whole bunch of long scrolls. So like my original drawings that I did for this book were around 1.5 feet tall by 6 feet wide.
Wow.
And I did 23 of those drawings and a whole bunch of sketchbooks. And I spent like a really concentrated 1.5 years just like totally getting into doing this book. I normally do other types of commercial art, but with this one, I managed to get a grant, and I've been living in an artist residency. So I really just isolated myself and made this book a total priority. And for the most part, it was kind of something that I did on my own. And I guess it's the type of thing where like I wrote like a draft of it pretty quickly. Just simple chicken scratch drawings and text that wasn't edited or anything. Just to kind of like work in a very straight line and take the notes and the ideas and interviews I'd had with my mom and try to internalize all that stuff and then work really instinctively on that rough version. And then I used that to inspire, a more densely illustrated, immersive version of it, by spending a lot of time working on the illustrations.
You mentioned the scroll format that you created this book, and it's interesting. I guess a couple of observations on my part as a reader. I think that the way that the book is put together, it would be easy to overlook the scroll aspect of Feast of Fields if you didn't know that that's the manner in which you wrote the story, or you illustrated the story, your mother's story of growing up briefly in an orphanage. But when you go back through, then you can go from one page to another and see how once you turn the page, continues from the previous 2-page spread. And I mean, that's quite striking. The other thing I wanted to remark on is the fact that you can even see this in your previous book, The Ghosts We Know. You seem to work in something like, you called it a scroll, but it seems to me as well also kind of a mural style. In other words, your art in your various comics, both Feast of Fields and The Ghosts We Know, and The Ghosts We Know is a collection of shorter stories and observations, they are laid out in ways that could be like a mural on the side of a building or on a large wall.
Yeah. That was kind of my thinking, was like, if I did the art in this way, it would have several different applications. I was also thinking, if I work in a scroll format, it gives me some freedom when I'm editing so that I can change the framing of the pages. But originally the book was done as a book form. Like I laid it out as pages first, and then I take those pages and I project them up onto a larger sheet of paper so that I have 6-page sequences side by side. And then what that allows me to do is it allows me to create sort of transitions in between moments and scenes, and kind of create, it allows me to sort of see where the story becomes more dense and where it becomes more open, so that I can play around with those types of psychological effects. An unforeseen benefit of working in this way is that now I'm working with a 3D artist named Charles Bernard, who does 3D books. Like he worked on Frank in the Third Dimension and some other books, and he's just an expert in that form. And he's helping me build a virtual reality version of this book. So we're taking these scrolls and making it so that you can read each scene using a VR headset like Google Daydream. But it's interesting that you mentioned murals, because currently I'm painting a whole bunch of murals inside the Vancouver General Hospital. And it's really got me thinking about how I might want to start doing these art pieces, like doing the original artwork for these books or other stories in the form of public murals, because I think it's an interesting way engage with a public audience.
And along with that, we should mention that, whether in scroll or even mural format, if you want to look at it that way, one of the things that does is it allows you to free yourself from traditional panel-to-panel kind of storytelling.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that, for listeners who may not be familiar with your work, is that the way that you lay out the dialogue in a somewhat sequential manner, and I say somewhat sequential because at times it's not entirely clear when you look at a particular page or perhaps a 2-page spread where we as readers should go next from one bit of dialogue or, let's say, a detached voiceover to the next. Now, you eventually figure it out, but there are times that I was reading Feast of Fields, and I think that I may have accidentally read ahead, so to speak, with some dialogue or with a voiceover. And then I realized, oops, I should have read another part first. And so not only is your art rather fluid, that one image kind of melds into and flows into another, but your text is the same way at times. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's tricky with doing this kind of format. I decided to sort of give myself this challenge. I became really interested in Will Eisner's open spreads. As I was when I started investigating comics as an adult and really getting into drawing comics again, I'd say Will Eisner was a huge influence on what I was doing. And then I basically started out by doing 2-page spreads in this way, where I would blend between the 2 pages, but then I liked how it kind of flowed between multiple pages or longer sequences with the text and images. At times I kind of have to be okay with the idea that it might be read in a different sequence than what I had originally intended. Although I try to use some directional elements to point the viewer in the directions that I'm intending, if it's really important. But also, now seeing this virtual reality version, it's even less linearly structured than the book version, which makes it totally an experiential thing rather than a linear type of narrative. Which for some people obviously is going to be confusing. It might not be their cup of tea, but it was something that I really wanted to experiment with. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Another thing that, given your style of illustration and also of dialogue and handling text, is, at least it strikes me as a reader, that many of your stories, and we can say this of Feast of Fields, and then the various pieces that are collected in The Ghosts We Know, have, more times than not, have something to do with memory and the past. And the way that I read those stories and Feast of Fields, along with your style of cartooning, of laying out the images and text in ways that kind of flow kind of freely in a way that is not overly structured, in many ways that kind of reflects the very act of memory, which is, of course, very fluid.
Yeah, that's kind of, well, it was something that I wanted to do with my comics. I was thinking of representing dreams or memories. In fact, with Feast of Fields, I'm using all of those kind of checker squares as a directional element within the compositions. But I was also thinking about when you close your eyes and you open them again, there's kind of these splotches of black, and also the after image of what you were thinking in your mind. And also, not only that, but I'm also drawing a lot of these things from memory. I'm not using visual references while I'm drawing them, because for me, it's more important that they represent memories rather than I'm trying to transcribe something that's like an actual representation of a physical event. It's more like a representation of a memory or a dream.
Right.
Yeah, so it's these were things that I was like trying to represent within these comics, and I'm glad that sort of comes across.
It does. Now, getting back to the new book, Feast of Fields, what was it about your mother's story, your mother's past, that drew you so that you dedicated this entire book to her life, especially when she was younger?
Yeah, well, it was just that I think that so much of our family histories can be lost within one generation. And this is something that I always knew I wanted to do. I've drawn some ideas about it in my sketchbook for a long time, and I've always talked to my mom about the idea that I'd like to do this at some point. So I decided that I would apply for a grant and see if I could make this work. Because I felt that more importantly than making it for an audience or making it for anybody else, it was something that I wanted to make to strengthen my relationship with my mom and also to have this thing as a memento. I've never been big on taking photos or anything like that. My art is kind of how I record my experiences and interact with the people around me. So it was something that I just really knew I needed to do. And I wanted to do it when I developed some level of skill. Like I learned a lot by doing the first book, The Ghosts We Know, and I could do my own personal stories and use that as a tool for expressing myself in that way. But when it came down to telling this story about my mom, I really knew I wanted to make sure that it did her story justice and that she was happy with it. So I wanted to put more time into developing the ideas and more time into actually physically sitting down and doing the work and focusing on it. And but it really was just something that I wanted to do mostly for personal reasons.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talk in Feast of Fields that one of the, I guess, instigating elements that propelled you into your mother's past was an old black and white photograph of her and one of her brothers. Mm-hmm. And so in real life, that is what actually did encourage you or give you the idea to begin this book?
Yeah, well, it's like the cabinet that's in the book that my mom stores a lot of the things from her childhood was something that I always had seen as a reference to the past. And I found it quite interesting that, my mom is not that much older than me, but the idea that these photographs were in black and white and they seem to be from a whole other era and other place, like they're wearing different kinds of clothes and it looks so much different than anything from my experience. So I always found that interesting. And even the little artifacts that she had in that cabinet were things that I found interesting because it's almost hard when you're a kid to imagine your parents being the same age as you and what their experiences would have been when they were young, because so much changes within one generation.
Is there anything about your mother's past, having grown up in Denmark, that particularly drew you?
Yeah, well, it's the type of thing that before I ever visited Denmark, I always had kind of like imagery in my mind of what it looked like. And when I visited Denmark, I've been there a number of times, but I remember when I was a kid or maybe a teenager and I visited there, I got a lot of deja vu where I would see things that somehow I recognized. And I feel like even though I wasn't born in Denmark and I've never lived there for any extended period of time, I think that maybe through some connection with your parents, you develop a sort of connection to where they're from. And that's the way I feel about Denmark is that somehow, because my mom has a long family lineage there, that I have some kind of connection to the country itself.
Mm. And your mother is still with us?
Yeah. And that's a large part of the reason why I wanted to do this book now, is because I wanted to make sure that I would get it done so that she could have a chance to be involved in the process and see me working on it all the way throughout, and have a chance to read it and be involved in it.
What are her thoughts about the finished product?
I think she's really happy with it. I've like from the very beginning, I gave her a large drawing that I made based on how I wanted to visually represent the characters in the story. And also I wrote a poem sort of to set the tone for how I wanted to represent the story. And she put those by her bedside, and she's had them sitting there for a while. And each time I've given her a new iteration of what I'm working on, from the rough version of the book to, more polished, edited things. I've always shared them with her, and she seems happy with all of it. It's the type of thing that if she wasn't happy with it, if she expressed any kind of that she was uncomfortable with anything, I would have been ready to cancel this at any point. It would have been difficult, which is kind of why I was sharing all of my early ideas with her, so that I can make sure that she was happy and comfortable with it. Of course, for her to read this type of thing and be involved with it and discuss these things with me is somewhat painful as well, because there were a lot of challenges and hardships in her childhood that are not easy for her to revisit.
Well, tell us a little bit about, without giving too much of the book away, about these challenges that she faced growing up.
Well, in her household, her mom was suffering from postpartum depression, which I guess triggered schizophrenia, and then when that happened, her mom was institutionalized, and her dad just basically left them, and they were put into an orphanage for a year. And then when my mom was the oldest, and when she was old enough, she moved her brothers back into a house with their mom, but their mom was still mentally ill. So my mother had to take control over making sure that everything was handled, and she kind of took on a lot of responsibility at a really young age. She kind of missed out on a lot of her childhood as a result of this.
Yeah, one of the things that really comes through in Feast of Fields is how much of a mother figure your mother was well before she was an actual mother. I mean, she was a caretaker of her brothers, and there were 3 younger ones, and that includes a young infant, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and that was something, basically the way I had to write the story is take these take these characters that I know, because all my uncles are still around too, and I know them, but the story is mostly focused on my mom. But taking these little stories that she's told me and kind of weaving them together into a larger narrative. Sorry, I lost track of
No,
I was saying.
Yeah, no, I was talking about her being a caretaker for her younger brothers during the year, especially that they were in the orphanage.
Yeah, and that's a role that she carried on through, up until they all moved out, and even though all of her siblings still live in Denmark and she lives in Canada, they have a pretty deep admiration and respect for her, and she's always, it carried across to how she was as a mom too. She's always been a very giving and selfless person. That's a large part of the reason why I felt compelled to write this book is to celebrate her.
Yeah, you can tell, especially from the opening pages, that you're quite close to your mother.
Yeah, and that's something that, as I've become an adult, and as we've gotten to know each other more as equals and as adults, our relationship has gotten stronger and stronger, and this book definitely even helped strengthen that further.
Yeah, in fact, the way that you begin Feast of Fields, I think, is quite interesting, because you begin with yourself, really. You start telling your own story about experiences in the past, and I believe that you and your parents are driving to your house in Crofton, British Columbia.
Yeah.
And you're asleep, and you're even dreaming, I guess, of Denmark because of your mother. Mm-hmm. And then you introduce us to how, at least to a point, how you were as a young boy, and then how in certain ways your mother was able to comfort you during some tough times that you had, maybe with bullies.
Yeah.
And then that eventually leads to you as an adult coming back, talking with your mom and working with her on her project. And then from that point forward, Feast of Fields becomes her story. And I remember in reading Feast of Fields for the first time, wondering if you would ever come back to yourself and your own contemporary story as a way of kind of framing the larger narrative. And although you don't, in a way that you do, because I found it curious, after your acknowledgments where you thank a variety of people who helped you along the way, then there is about 6 pages or so where you go into a bit of detail about how you created Feast of Fields. Mm-hmm. So in many ways, you do return to your own story.
Yeah. Well, that was also, I thought that so much of this book is kind of process-based, and I wanted to sort of share the way that it was made so that it was clear for anybody who was interested. Because, the process was something I kind of evolved from the last book. And when I released the last book, there was some confusion about how it was all put together. And I thought it was kind of important to explain that. But also I can't help but inject something of myself into the story, because so much of it is my own personal connection and interpretation of it. Does that explain that?
Yeah, it does. It does. Now, you mentioned just now that there was a little confusion as to the way your last book, The Ghosts We Know, was put together. What was the basis of that confusion?
Well, there was one review that said it was all drawn digitally and all this kind of stuff, which is fine, but I just wanted to make sure that it was clear in this case, the way that it was all done. Because for me, it's just, and also just because I'm really interested in filmmaking as well. And when I'm watching movies, I quite often like watching the special features at the end to learn more about the filmmaker and learn more about the process and that kind of thing. Because even though this process that I use for this book seems really strange, it's also something that I've found to be really effective as a working method, not only for generating comic books, graphic novels, but also for creating something sort of cinematic and also something in virtual reality. So in a way, I kind of hope that other people might adopt some of these ideas and techniques.
You mentioned your interests in filmmaking. I noticed on your website, Karemaker.com, that there is a little over 5-minute film, kind of a bio of you. Now, were you the one behind the camera, so to speak, while at the same time being in front?
No, not with that. I've actually hardly made any movies, but I'm interested in techniques of filmmaking. Mm-hmm. And applying those techniques towards drawing comics. I think there's a lot of valuable information that can be shared between these two mediums, mm-hmm. and so I try to adopt some things from filmmaking that I think I can use within my own process. Like, for example, drawing on scrolls gives me more of a chance to get really creative in the editing stage. It makes it less rigid for me as far as say I drew a whole bunch of pages. I'm pretty much going to have to represent those pages as I've drawn them. They're all going to be framed in the way that I've drawn them. other than if I wanted to redraw them. Whereas within these scrolls, I can kind of zoom in and out. I can pan and cut them differently, and I can play around with like the format a little bit more. But also, I was really interested in making something that had a really cinematic flow to it, something that has like transitions in between scenes and plays around with some of those things that are classically represented in films. So I kind of like to be inspired by several different avenues.
Yeah, I think that the word flow is quite appropriate when describing your form of visual storytelling.
Yeah. Something that was really important to me is that that there's like a really clear flow in between the stories, and that was something that I started doing on The Ghosts We Know. When I was asked by Conundrum if I would want to do a compilation version of all these comics that I'd been releasing, I was really interested in the idea of not only just slapping a bunch of stories together, but thinking about how one story would end and the other one would pick up, and how that would visually carry across. So when I was structuring that book, I created a lot of new content to bridge between stories to make it so that it had a clear flow. And I actually would turn it into PDFs, and I would look at it on a projector, and I would flip through the story, not reading it, but just seeing how it felt as you're flipping from one page to the next. And I had that same concern on this book. It was a really important aspect of what I was trying to achieve.
Now, you mentioned the various comics that make up The Ghost We Know. Were many of these stories, if not all of them, originally published through your anthology zine, Astronaut Journal?
Yeah, that was kind of all, what I was doing with that. And Astronaut Journal was basically, it started out as a blog. I started just doing social observations about different people that I saw around town, and then eventually I started realizing that I had a real desire to tell personal stories. So I started focusing more on my own feelings and experiences, and getting into my personal history. And then eventually more and more people started reading my sketchbooks of the people I was working with and people I knew. And those people encouraged me to release these as self-published comics. And so I did that. And that started leading me to getting art shows and feeling like I could maybe do something with that. And so after I'd released enough of these to make a book, just serendipitously, I got contacted by Conundrum Press. And it was really nice working with them because they didn't really want to have too much editorial control over what I was doing, so I could kind of represent these stories as they were originally drawn. And it was just a really great experience. Andy from Conundrum has a lot of good suggestions and good ideas, but he really finds things that he likes, and he allows those artists to work creatively on their own projects. And it was a good experience.
Really? So Andy Brown reached out to you. It's not that you went to Conundrum to see if they would publish your work?
No, it was there's an artist in Vancouver called Julian Lawrence who also releases books with Conundrum, and he told Andy that he should look into my work. And I guess, like looking at what the types of work that Andy publishes, I can see why it would fit perfectly well. Mm-hmm. I hadn't really been aware of Conundrum before this, to be honest. And since I've signed with them, I get a lot of their books, and they're really one of my favorite publishers, or I'd have to say my favorite publisher. I really like, right now I'm reading David Collier's work, and I feel like that has a really has some relationship to what I'm doing, just serendipitously. But there's just a lot of people doing really personal, experimental comics with that publisher, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
Yeah, I've thought for quite a while that Conundrum is one of those gems, those presses that unfortunately is overlooked, but they do a lot of really good stuff, and I wish more people knew about Conundrum.
Yeah, and I think it's like, within people who read a lot of graphic novels who are into stuff that's not within the pop culture, most of those people know Conundrum, but a lot of people, just walking down the street would have never heard of it. And that's a real shame because they produce a ton of good stuff every year. And, but I guess it's kind of just the nature of what's happening with graphic novels in North America. So much of it's focused on, sensational pop culture, superheroes and science fiction and stuff like that. And then there's a few notable publishers that get a fairly big readership producing, more personal or what I truly consider to be more literary type of stories. But generally there's just not a huge amount of people reading these types of stories in North America.
Yeah. Now, earlier you mentioned something about having written, I guess, poetry for your mother.
Mm-hmm.
And her keeping it by the bed. And that made me think of your style of writing. And I can see this not only in Feast of Fields, but also in the various pieces that compose The Ghost We Know. I got the sense that there is, if not a poetic, then a literary style that you bring to your text. In other words, you describe things in such a way that there seems to be more sensitivity to sensual detail in ways that you really don't find in comics. And I'm not talking about just mainstream stuff. I'm talking about even alternative and indie. In other words, your style is striking, your writing style is striking in that it seems to have more literary heft, if that makes sense. And I'm wondering if you intentionally write that way or if it just is second nature to you.
I think I'm just trying to write with feeling. Like I'm trying to make art with feeling, and I'm trying to write with feeling, and I'm trying to connect my feelings to other people. But it's funny. I had a real trouble even considering myself to be a writer. I didn't have an easy time in school, and I've never had any training in really any of this stuff. So I had a lot of imposter syndrome when it comes to writing. But I found that what I like to do is I just like to write really fluidly, without thinking too much about it. And sometimes I find I'm editing things down, like I'm reducing the text to its simplest form. So that it's not too flowery or not too overdone, but I'm pretty intuitive when it comes to writing, and I just try to write things that make me feel emotional. I try to immerse myself in the emotions of what I'm doing.
Mm. Well, you can definitely see that in Feast of Fields, in that, as you put it earlier, you kind of in an empathic way invest yourself in your mother's story. So it's almost as if you inhabit her for a good part of the narrative. And that takes a particular kind of sensitivity that I think a lot of storytellers aren't able to accomplish, but you do that quite well.
Well, thank you. Yeah, there was definitely something that I really wanted to do I just didn't want to tell like a detached story from an outside perspective. I wanted to really have like more of an understanding. So it's a fictionalized version of what really happened, with key events that she felt really were important to her experience. But within that, I'm trying to imagine what it was like to be there, and imagine, more importantly, what it felt like to be there. I don't get overly concerned with with representing the environment as it really was, or representing, costumes as they really were. Things kind of morph around a little bit, and it's kind of dreamlike, but I really like if I'm trying to understand the story a little better, I have to try to project myself into thinking, here's the events. How would that make me feel if I was a kid at that age, Um, and so I try to get really invested in it.
Now, you mentioned the fictionalization, at least to a point, of your mother's story in Feast of Fields, and there are quite a number of autobiographical pieces in your previous book, The Ghosts We Know. Now, I'm aware that there's no such thing as 100% pure autobiography that adheres to what actually happened in life, that there's some fiction inserted in some form or another. I'm curious, in terms of The Ghosts We Know, with those more overtly autobiographical pieces, how much fictionalizing did you engage in?
Well, there's some things in there that are metaphor for things that I was feeling or thinking. But for example, in The Ghosts We Know, there's a story where my character goes on a walk into the woods and finds this cabin where he gets transformed into a bird guy, and it's just like some of those things are sort of stream of consciousness, and then later on I start to assign meaning to them. But I find that sometimes this type of stream of consciousness storytelling can be more personal or more connected to your inner thoughts or deeper memories. And then also, in The Ghosts We Know, I'm representing, real events more or less as they happen, but through the filter of memory. And I also recognize that that I'm a storyteller as well. Like, I want to make stories that are structured in a way that is going to be interesting for people to read and also interesting for me to tell. So, in The Ghosts We Know, I tried focusing on a lot of stories that were things that I've retold many times over, just to my friends or family, just as a story you tell at the dinner table. So those are stories that I've already, cut out all the parts that are not interesting. In some cases, subconsciously you take that story and restructure it so that it has more of like a punchline or more of an interesting structure. I think that everybody does it, and I think that if we were representing life as it really happened, it just wouldn't be very interesting. I think for me, I want to represent the emotions as they really were. Sometimes taking the different things that happen in real life and restructuring them in such a way that they build up towards those emotions in a more impactful way.
You mentioned the bird creature that you use to represent yourself, and I wanted to ask you about that. In The Ghosts We Know, there are some stories where you represent yourself as a young boy, as a human. On the other hand, there are other stories where sometimes the entire story, you're represented as this bird figure, or, as you mentioned, you may start off as a human, but then there's this kind of transformation where all of a sudden we see you represented as this bird figure. And I'm wondering about the significance of the bird figure and how you use that to represent yourself at times.
Well, it's something that I always kind of drew myself that way when I was a kid. I've drawn this character and some of these other bird-like characters for a long time. I was trying to think about why that was. One thing that happened when I was young was I would get bullied quite a lot, and I got hand-me-down clothes. My legs, I had a huge growth spurt. My legs would stick out of the bottoms of my pants. And I remember they would call me chicken legs and stuff like that. And maybe I just took ownership over that, I guess. Just that I decided that if I was going to be called something like that, I might as well just become that. And I guess for me, when I was drawing the book, the character transforms a lot because in the process of making it, I was trying to figure out more or less who I was. And I think that it's also like there's different aspects of who I am. Sometimes I represent myself as like this like ape with hair all over his face and no facial features, and sometimes I represent myself, kind of how I look in real life. And then sometimes I represent myself as this astronaut character. Originally I did the astronaut character because I was thinking that like I felt pretty detached from a lot of society at the time. When I was making The Ghosts We Know in particular, I felt really very much like an outsider. I was living in Vancouver and working at a video game company, and I didn't really feel very connected to video game culture. I wasn't dating anybody. I felt kind of lonely. And so I think that I started drawing comics as a way of sort of self-exploration.
Representing yourself in these ways to suggest the alienation or the difference or detachment, I think, is fascinating. I couldn't help but think, in terms of reading the various stories in The Ghosts We Know, where you do represent yourself as this bird-like figure, couldn't help but think of how creators like, let's say, Trondheim represents himself as a bird, and then Jason, many times it's as I think a dog-like figure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, were you intentionally working within those kind of loose traditions, or is this something, you completely spun out on your own?
Well, there's a part of me that, like, it's funny you mentioned Jason, because some people pointed out afterwards that the character kind of looks a little bit like that. But when I made it, I wasn't aware of Jason's work. It was more like, I was thinking, like there's a long tradition in North America of anthropomorphizing characters. Like I was thinking about Disney and some, Looney Tunes and stuff like that, where I might take ownership over my own kind of version of a pop culture character. But these are also things that I've been drawing in my sketchbooks for a long time. Some of the characters that I'm drawing in Astronaut Journal are things that I wasn't necessarily trying to draw myself. I was just drawing, but I would take these images I'd drawn when I was like, 7 or 8 years old, and I would project myself into them. So I would take a lot of visual imagery that I'd drawn when I was a kid, and I would readopt it in my new comics. But I have a feeling that some of that stuff was pretty inspired by Disney and that kind of thing, because that was a big part of my psyche when I was a kid.
You mentioning your art as a young boy, I couldn't help but think of the story in The Ghosts We Know Origin, where you tell us a little bit about how you became a cartoonist.
Yeah. Well, it was just like, for me, it was just, I think that comics were one of the major art forms that I had access to when I was a kid. Like growing up in a small town, I never went to any art galleries. I didn't really know much about, the history of art, but comic books were something that I was really drawn to. And you could find them, in pawn shops or in secondhand stores or wherever. And I also found it interesting that there's kind of an element of history, because you could find comics that were all the way back from the 50s or 60s, and they had ads in them from a whole different time, and they might be represented in a totally different style than modern comics. But yeah, it was just something that, like, I think I was always interested in art, and I think comics were just something that hit me in the right time and place, and that's really what inspired me as a young artist. And then when I became an adult, I really realized how much of a longing that I had to continue doing that, because, for years I'd kind of been sucked into different industries using my art to make a living. But comics were always something that was really important to me. And I realized that by continuing to do it, it really filled a part of myself that was missing for a long time.
Now, you were mentioning some of the symbolism that we can find in, let's say, the way that you represent yourself at times as a bird-like figure in some of your stories in The Ghosts We Know. I think an overriding symbol that we can see throughout your comics is ghosts. I mean, obviously there are the ghosts in the title story of The Ghosts We Know, which I believe is the very last piece. But there are other ghosts who populate the various pieces in The Ghosts We Know. But I think we can also see ghosts of the past in Feast of Fields.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think for me, like, the idea of a ghost is multifaceted. It's something that, like, I've actually seen ghosts, like what people would say is supernatural, where you see something that's like an apparition that appears. And that was something that had a big impact on me when I was a kid, and it sort of dominated my mind all the way up until now. Like, what are those things? What do they represent? But also, taking the archetype image of a sheet ghost that anybody can recognize as a ghost. It's also a figure that has no recognizable features. It could be anybody, so it allows maybe other people to project themselves into the story, and it's kind of an ambiguous character. It also kind of has like a bit of a mysterious feeling to it. And so, and even the idea of a ghost could represent somebody who's invisible in society as well.
And you talk quite a bit about invisibility, especially when you were young and growing up. Yeah,
it's kind of how I felt, and for me at that age, art was my main outlet. Like, I remember, I was just really shy and really, really withdrawn. It wasn't that I got bullied relentlessly or anything. Like, I did get bullied, but it was also just that I was a really quiet and shy person, and I found that I could really express myself in my sketchbooks. I used to really look forward to when people would stop me and want us to make art. I saw that as a communication tool because it's really young. I was almost nonverbal. I had trouble in school with fitting into the class because I just really had a time talking with people.
Now, I know that Feast of Fields was released earlier this month, but it debuted at TCAF, correct?
Yeah.
Well, what kind of publicity have you been doing with this or for this new book?
Well, so far I just went to TCAF and VanCAF. In between then and now, I've been going to a whole bunch of schools and doing drawing exercises with the kids, and sort of getting them to encourage themselves to express themselves emotionally through art and storytelling. And then I started painting some murals. So I really haven't had too much time, but I want to start making some library appearances and stuff like that. I'm kind of new to the whole process of how to promote books and all that kind of thing. So I'm going to need to talk with the marketing person at Conundrum to see if they have some ideas about what I should be doing.
Yeah, get with Sarah and see if she can get you out.
Yeah, because like Sarah has better ideas about that. It's never been my strongest suit with that, but I definitely want people to be aware of it. So I need to figure out how I can promote it.
Yeah, you mentioned going to schools. There's at least one story in The Ghosts We Know where you write about working with students in workshops in school settings, and so I'm wondering. How long have you been doing this, and how might that feed into your creativity?
I've been doing teaching for maybe about 5 years or something like that, and for me, I find it to be really inspiring because, when I was a kid, I always think I would have liked to have known an adult artist, somebody who's really pursuing what they're doing, because that would have really inspired me at a young age and shown me that, like, there's somebody who's older than me who's continuing to do this kind of thing and make it into a lifestyle. And also, kids just have like a really high level of creative energy, and they're less inhibited than adults. So when I'm teaching some drawing workshops or comics workshops, or I do stop motion and other types of things, some of the ideas that the kids have are far more interesting and creative than a lot of the things that I hear from adult creators. They might not have the technical skills to achieve, very finished product. But some of the mini comics that I get from these little kids are crazy and interesting, and I often wish that I had come up with some of these ideas. But it's also just like, I like to feel like the things that I'm doing for a living are having a benefit in society and to people. And I think teaching has a very direct feeling of helping people and giving that feeling of satisfaction.
Yeah, and the story in particular that I'm thinking of in The Ghosts We Know is fairly early in the collection. It's Time Machine, and this is during one of these sessions, and there's a young girl, I think her name is Anna, and she's shy. She doesn't want to really interact with the other kids. She sits apart, but then you, as the instructor, discover that she has this really incredible drawing of like a girl on a golden throne, and in a field of flowers. And then you show that to the rest of the class. She's satisfied, but you don't end there. Basically, what you do is you use that experience as a way to kind of transport yourself, thus the title Time Machine, back to when you were young and you felt very shy like Anna.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's something I quite often see. I think that a lot of kids who are really interested in art are often the kids who have social phobias or have social anxiety, or they're just really withdrawn. Like it's not too common that you find kids who are exceptional with art who are not really just focused in their own time on making art. Like I've seen some examples of kids who are as young as 6 years old who are producing pretty mind-blowing stuff, like far beyond their age. But it's because they spend all their time alone doing this stuff, which I like to reach out to these kids to let them know that, like, you don't really have to be alone to do that. Like I've overcome a lot of social phobias in my life. Like now I do public speaking and I do a lot of public stuff. At one point in my life, that would have seemed very terrifying. And so it's kind of interesting for me to see some of these kids who might eventually go through this transition in their life as well. And I like to let them know that I had a similar experience when I was a kid. When you're at that age, you almost believe that nothing's ever going to change, that you're just going to be the same way. That if you have phobias, that they're just part of your personality and you're going to have to live with them. But from my experience, it's been something that I've been able to make changes and challenge myself and overcome a lot of fears. And I like to inspire people in that way.
Yeah. So you mentioned the classes that you're teaching and also the mural that you're working on. Are there any comics that you're currently in the middle of right now?
Well, yeah, I'm working on a comic story right now for the Dalhousie Review, and the idea that I want to do for it, I've kind of drafted up a rough version, is I want to do a short story that pays tribute to a friend of mine named Ron McGrath. And Ron was he was a poet and writer. He worked for Megaphone magazine. It's like a street publication in Vancouver. And I met him one time at one of my art shows, and he offered that he would like to meet up sometime that he could share his poems with me. So I met up with him and we did some collaborations, but recently he passed away, and I was trying to sort of make sense of it and sort of like, I had some realizations about him after he died, and I wanted to sort of look at those realizations and look at him as a human being, and so that's what I'm working on right now. Is that piece. I always want to be doing some comic stuff. I always have like, a few sketchbooks on the go of different ideas, and I sort of choose what's most appropriate to work on at the time. I don't want to sink my teeth into a new graphic novel right away. I kind of think I need a bit of a break from that, but like I think that I'll be working on some short stories over the next year and maybe starting to incorporate what I've developed in my comics into public murals and things like that.
What about your anthology Astronaut Journal? Has that more or less been put behind you?
No, I have written more stories. Like, I think, I'm not sure like when I'll release those, but I have written new stories for Astronaut Journal. And I think that maybe sometime, maybe this year, maybe next year, I'll probably release another issue of Astronaut Journal.
And these are self-published, right?
Yeah, that'll be self-published. And then maybe it would be something that, like, this time around, I would like to focus more on a structured narrative made out of short stories. I really like that format where it could be, short 5 to 10 page stories that construct a larger narrative.
Kind of like a short story cycle.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Now, for those who may be interested in Astronaut Journal, since it's self-published, through what means could people check out? I mean, obviously they can look at some back issues that you have available on your website, SeanKaremaker.com. But if they wanted to get hard copies of Astronaut Journal, are there any of your past ones that are still available? And when you come out with a new one, how can people get it?
I actually have to admit, like, I just make small runs of all of those. Like I did maybe 500 copies of each of them or something like that. And when I sell them, I don't reprint them until I'll do a larger volume. So none of them are really available in printed form, but that's why I put them up for free on my website, is then people can access them in that way. I'd like to maybe take the time to release more smaller comics or zines, but I ultimately, I guess the way I like to read comics is most often in the form of longer volumes or graphic novels.
Mm-hmm. Which is what we have in The Ghosts We Know, which collects many of those pieces of yours in Astronaut Journal.
Yeah. The one thing though is, like, the original ones were printed larger in size and they were printed in color. Some of them were printed on a different color paper and they were printed larger in size. But the problem with that is just that, like, I was never concerned too much with the profits on them. I would print them at a cost that was pretty much what I was selling them for, because I wanted to make them into something that was like exactly what I had in mind. So it's something that's hard to distribute through stores or whatever. Like, I mostly just sold them at like markets or comic conventions or things like that. And in a way, I kind of like the idea that it's something that, like, you need to get when it comes out. Otherwise, it might be hard to find it later.
Right. Get it while it's fresh, kind of like your mother's baked bread.
Yeah, totally.
Now, we've mentioned your website, SeanKaremaker.com, and that's one word, SeanKaremaker.com. Are there other means online that you make your work available that people could check out, or is your website the main home base?
I think that probably Instagram is the main way that I update on a regular basis. So It would just be my name, Sean Karemaker, all one word, all lowercase. And you can find me on Instagram. And I post a lot of my long scroll drawings on there, split into sections, and I do some interactive things on there, but I'm posting on there more regularly just because it's so much easier than updating my website. But I use Instagram quite a lot.
Okay. Well, Sean, I want to thank you for taking the time and talking with me about your new book, Feast of Fields, as well as your previous book, The Ghosts We Know. It's been wonderful getting to know you and talking about your fabulous work.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you for taking the time. And I hope everybody enjoys the book.
I want to thank Sean Karemaker once again for talking with me about Feast of Fields, his collection, The Ghosts We Know, and his work as an artist educator. And if you enjoyed my conversation with Sean about his style of storytelling, then check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. In addition to comics from the mainstream, every month you'll find great discounts on alternative and lesser-known titles, the kind of comics you'll find from Sean and others published by Conundrum Press. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought about my conversation with Sean Karemaker. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can contact me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. Stay tuned for more Comics Alternative programming. And until then, take care.
Thank you.